Before we dive into the story, don't forget to comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries and gangster stories for sleep. I want to hear where you're watching from, so drop your city or country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Now, let's begin. They called him both a saint and a monster. To the poor of Medellín, he was Don Pablo, the man who built their schools, handed out food, and paid for their children's surgeries. To judges, politicians, and police officers, he was a nightmare, the man whose shadow stretched across the nation, offering them only two choices, silver or lead. Pablo Escobar lived as both myth and man, a figure who feared sleep because he believed the moment he closed his eyes, someone would come for him. His story didn't begin in mansions or private zoos. It began on December 1, 1949, in a small hospital in Rio Negro, Colombia. His father was a farmer, his mother a teacher who believed in rules, faith, and discipline. But outside their door, Colombia was already boiling with violence. Liberals and conservatives weren't arguing, they were killing each other. The country was on fire, and little Pablo grew up watching how quickly law broke under the weight of hunger and fear. He hated being overlooked. He hated worn shoes and empty plates. More than anything, he hated being invisible. By his teens, he was selling stolen tombstones to crooked funeral homes, later hijacking trucks filled with cigarettes and electronics. He was clever, quick to learn, and ruthless when he needed to be. By 15, he was bribing policemen with folded bills and charming smiles. By 18, he was already building a name in Medellín's underworld, quiet, steady, calculating. But petty smuggling wasn't enough. In the bars of Medellín, whispers started about a new product trickling in from Peru and Bolivia. A white powder small enough to fit in a pocket, but valuable enough to change a life. Cocaine. Older men laughed at the idea of smuggling it across borders. Too risky, they said. Too small time. Pablo didn't laugh. He studied it, watched carefully, and saw what no one else saw. Cocaine wasn't just a drug, it was gold in powder form. He told friends he would one day rule Colombia, not through politics, but through fear and loyalty. At night, he drove to the hills overlooking Medellín, staring down at the lights as if they were already his. One day, he whispered, "This will all belong to me." The first time he held a gun, he said it felt like holding the future, cold, heavy, full of decisions. He understood early that in his world, reputation was worth more than muscle. If people feared you, they respected you. If they respected you, they paid you. And Pablo Escobar never intended to be ignored again. By the early 1970s, Medellín's streets were alive with whispers of a young man who moved differently. Pablo was still in his 20s, but he already carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the rules of the game and how to bend them. He wasn't the biggest thief, nor the most violent, but what separated him from the rest was vision. While others chased small profits, he was quietly planning empires. One night, a pilot brought him news of a strip of land near the coast. Remote, hidden by palms, guarded only by silence. Pablo drove out to see it for himself. He walked the muddy ground, studying the soil, the distance to the sea, the cover of trees. To most men it was just an empty clearing. To him, it was a runway. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes told the men with him everything. This was the beginning of something bigger than anyone could imagine. Within weeks, the land was alive with movement. Villagers were paid to guard the paths. Mechanics were bribed to bring in tools. Armed men stood watch at the edges. Then came the test flight. No moon, no lights, just the soft roar of a twin-engine plane lifting from the jungle. Its cargo was modest, a few kilos bound for Miami. Hours later, the word came back, it landed safe. By sunrise, the money was already crossing back into Colombia. The profits dwarfed anything Pablo had touched before. A kilo bought for under $1,000 in the Andes could sell for 50 times that in the United States. Multiply that by dozens, then hundreds, and soon the numbers stopped making sense. Pablo wasn't interested in numbers, he was interested in control. Control of supply, of routes, of men. He began studying not just maps of Colombia but of Panama, the Bahamas, even Mexico. He learned radar blind spots, customs routines, the weaknesses of coast guards. Every mile of the journey became part of his design. To secure these routes, he needed allies. That's when names that would later echo through history entered the story. Carlos Leder, the wild half-German smuggler who discovered Norman's Cay in the Bahamas, a perfect refueling hub for planes on their way to Florida. The Ochoa brothers, wealthy ranchers with polished manners and deep connections in Colombian politics. Each brought something to the table. Leder the planes, the Ochoas the money and respectability. Pablo brought the muscle, the vision, and the will to do whatever it took. Together, they weren't just moving cocaine, they were building the Medellín cartel. What began as whispers in backrooms hardened into an organization so disciplined it rivaled governments. Routes were tested, refined, and protected with bribes and bullets. Police captains were paid off, customs agents looked the other way, and anyone who hesitated faced the old choice, plata o plomo. Silver or lead. Back in Medellín, Pablo didn't forget his stage. He bought groceries for families, paid for surgeries, and built soccer fields where children played in his name. Mothers called him a blessing. Fathers shook his hand like he was a savior. But behind the applause, his eyes were fixed on the skies. The cocaine superhighway was being paved one flight at a time, and Pablo Escobar was already imagining the empire it would carry. The empire was still young, but it was growing faster than anyone could control. In Medellín's smoky bars, smugglers bragged about their latest runs: contraband cigarettes, stolen appliances, counterfeit lottery tickets. But when Pablo spoke, he didn't talk about petty scores. He asked questions about pilots, chemists, airstrips, and border patrols. Men began to realize he wasn't thinking about hundreds of pesos. He was thinking about billions. One night in the jungle, he stood inside a makeshift lab where coca leaves were crushed, soaked, and cooked down into paste. The air smelled of gasoline and sweat. A chemist dipped his finger into the white powder, rubbed it on his gums, and grinned. "This," he told Pablo, "is the future." Pablo didn't smile. He stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and looked up at the canopy. To him, it wasn't just powder. It was gold that could fit in a pocket and cross borders without making a sound. His vision stretched far beyond Medellín. He wanted control from leaf to nose, farmers, labs, pilots, distributors. No middlemen. No outsiders. He bought land in remote valleys, paying campesinos to grow coca by the ton. He recruited chemists to refine it into powder with higher purity than anyone else's product. And he built networks of pilots willing to risk their lives for cash thicker than their weight. But Pablo also understood loyalty. He didn't just buy it with money. He bought it with favors. He paid for a neighbor's rent, covered hospital bills, bought groceries for a widow. People in the barrios whispered his name with respect. Children cheered when his car rolled past. Journalists began writing about a mysterious figure who gave to the poor even as whispers of violence followed him. The myth was forming, part saint, part shadow. Still, rivals tested him. One night, a rival crew intercepted a truck carrying stolen electronics Pablo had arranged. They wanted to remind him to stay in his lane. Most men might have backed down. Pablo didn't. He tracked the man who gave the order for 3 days, then left him alive but broken, his knee shattered, dumped in a ditch. It wasn't revenge, it was a lesson. Word spread quickly. Escobar did not forgive insults. He didn't need to shout. His silence carried the weight of a bullet. Meanwhile, in the United States, cocaine was beginning to explode in popularity. Wealthy partygoers in Manhattan and Los Angeles snorted it off mirrors and dollar bills. Musicians sang about it. Wall Street brokers used it to fuel endless nights of work. Demand was insatiable, and Pablo saw the opportunity. While others moved grams, he thought in kilos, then in tons. The partnership with Carlos Leder brought Norman's Cay into full use. It became a hub in the Bahamas, a secret highway in the sky, where planes could refuel and leapfrog into Florida. Each landing brought back millions. The Ochoa brothers handled laundering and political cover. Pablo's men kept order with bribes and, when necessary, bullets. By the mid-1970s, the Medellín cartel was no longer a rumor. It was a machine, running with precision, fed by greed, and fueled by fear. And at its center stood a young man who once stole tombstones for pocket change, now holding the power to outthink governments. Yet even as he built his empire, he began to feel it, the eyes of enemies, jealous and waiting. The first real cracks appeared not in his empire but in the people around him. Rivals who had once laughed at his ambition now saw him rising too quickly, his name whispered in airports and shipping docks, his reach stretching far beyond Medellín. One crew made the mistake of hijacking a shipment linked to him, a truck of electronics meant to fund his next run. They thought it would go unnoticed. Pablo made sure it didn't. He followed the man behind it for days, never rushing, never speaking. When the time came, he didn't kill him. Instead, his men shattered the man's knee and left him alive in a ditch. The message was louder than any bullet: disrespect Pablo Escobar, and you will live the rest of your life remembering it. From then on, his reputation was sealed. He was not just another smuggler, he was someone who made examples. That lesson spread quickly through Medellín's underworld. Young hustlers began to flock to him, hoping for protection and fortune. He recruited carefully, never trusting anyone fully. Each man was given a role: drivers, pilots, guards, accountants, but no one was indispensable. Betrayal was met with silence, then disappearance. His organization was built like a machine where loyalty was the only currency. With each successful flight through Norman's Cay, the money grew beyond imagination. It became a burden rather than a blessing. Warehouses were filled with cash stacked to the ceiling. Accountants stopped counting and started weighing bundles on scales. Millions were buried in barrels across Colombia, hidden in farms, forests, even under his own houses. Entire fields were turned into vaults. Rats chewed through some. Rain destroyed others. Pablo shrugged. It was only a fraction of what kept pouring in. But wealth was only half the story. With money came power, and Pablo knew power lasted longer when it wore two faces. In the barrios, he built entire neighborhoods, complete with electricity and water. He paid for soccer fields, bought Christmas gifts for children, and even funded hospitals. To the poor, he was Don Pablo, the man who gave when governments abandoned them. Mothers prayed for him, murals painted his smile, children wore his name on their shirts. Yet beyond the barrios, the other face showed itself. Journalists who asked too many questions were silenced. Judges who dared to sign extradition papers were marked for death. Rival traffickers who encroached on his routes vanished in the night. Politicians were handed envelopes stuffed with cash or coffins. The phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, was no longer a slogan. It was a law, whispered in every police station, courtroom, and newsroom in Colombia. By now, the Medellín cartel had become a shadow government, with Pablo at its head. He had planes, boats, soldiers, politicians, and priests on his payroll. But with power came paranoia. He slept in different houses every night, moving his family without warning. Guards circled the grounds, radios buzzed through the dark, pistols rested under pillows. Even at the height of his wealth, Escobar never knew rest. He told a confidant once, "A king doesn't sleep. Sleep is when they take your crown." And still, in the distance, he could feel other eyes watching, the rival Cali cartel sharpening their knives, and the Colombian government, now under American pressure, beginning to stir. The empire truly came alive in the skies. Pablo once said that cocaine didn't move like drugs, it moved like rivers. And he was the one who built the channels. What began as a single plane from a jungle strip turned into an aerial highway stretching from Colombia to Florida, from Peru to the Bahamas. The world above the clouds belonged to him. Norman's Cay, the Bahamian island Carlos Leder had secured, became the beating heart of this operation. On the surface it was a quiet paradise, turquoise waters, white sand, and palm trees swaying in the breeze. But beneath the postcard view was an airstrip that never slept. Planes packed with bricks of cocaine landed and refueled like taxis. Local officials were bribed, residents either scared into silence or bought off. From there, flights leapt into Florida with ease, slipping under radar, sometimes cutting engines to glide silently over the waves before reigniting just miles from shore. The profits were staggering. A kilo bought in Colombia for under $1,000 sold in Miami for $50,000. Multiply that by the hundreds of kilos shipped each week, and the cartel was soon bringing in an estimated $60 million a day. So much cash flowed back that Escobar's accountants stopped trying to count it. They weighed bundles of bills on scales and wrapped them in rubber bands. Pablo joked that one of his biggest expenses was buying enough bands to hold his fortune together. Smuggling methods grew more creative with every month. Trucks with hidden compartments, boats with false floors, even submarines were built to carry his product. Families carried dolls stuffed with powder, couriers swallowed balloons filled with cocaine, sweating through airport security. For every mule caught, 3 more made it through. For every shipment seized, 2 more landed safely. To Pablo, the losses were nothing more than overhead. Meanwhile, Miami transformed almost overnight. Nightclubs filled with clouds of white dust. Wall Street traders used it to fuel endless hours. Rock stars bragged about it, actors whispered about it. Cocaine was no longer a back alley drug, it was glamour, status, a symbol of wealth. And at the center of it all was Medellín, the city that had once raised a poor boy now turned into the global hub of a multi-billion-dollar empire. But with success came fire. The DA began linking seizures to Colombia. American newspapers ran stories about a mysterious Medellín cartel, painting it as an invisible hand flooding the country with drugs. In Bogotá, politicians faced pressure to sign extradition treaties that would allow Colombian traffickers to be tried in U.S. courts. To Pablo, extradition was the only thing he feared. He told his closest men, better a grave in Colombia than a cell in America. The war hadn't started yet, but the first sparks were there. Judges whispered about threats. Police convoys were ambushed in the hills. And still, in the barrios, Pablo drove through streets handing out food, smiling for mothers who blessed him, shaking hands with fathers who saw him as their savior. 2 faces, 2 worlds. The cocaine superhighway brought him riches beyond measure, but it also carried him closer to the storm he could already hear rumbling on the horizon. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a trafficker. He was a king living behind walls that looked like paradise. Hacienda Napoles, his vast estate outside Medellín, became the symbol of his power. The gates opened to reveal thousands of acres of land filled with marvels few Colombians had ever seen. There was a private zoo with giraffes and elephants imported from Africa, hippos bathing in artificial lakes, a bull ring, even a replica of the plane that had carried his first load of cocaine. Helicopters landed on manicured lawns. Parties stretched late into the night, filled with politicians, beauty queens, priests, and anyone else willing to stay close to his shadow. Wealth poured in faster than anyone could spend it. Forbes magazine eventually listed him among the richest men in the world, but Pablo hardly noticed. He measured success in control, not in rankings. Money was buried in barrels across Colombia, hidden in barns, forests, and fields. Millions rotted from mold or were eaten by rats. He shrugged. For every lost dollar, 10 more came in. Accountants no longer counted, they weighed stacks of cash on industrial scales. Still, Pablo knew wealth alone wouldn't save him. The United States was pushing harder for extradition treaties, determined to drag traffickers into foreign courts. To him, that was the greatest threat. He believed dying in Colombia was honorable, but living in an American prison was unbearable. So, he shifted his focus to politics. He poured money into campaigns, funded public works, and built neighborhoods with his name on them. For the poor, this wasn't bribery, it was salvation. Whole families moved from shacks into new homes he had built. Children went to schools that bore his name. In their eyes, he wasn't a criminal. He was a leader who had risen from their struggles. When Escobar ran for a seat in Colombia's Chamber of Representatives, crowds filled plazas chanting his name. He wasn't polished, but he didn't need to be. He was one of them, a man from the dirt who had climbed higher than anyone thought possible. And when he won his seat, the cheers echoed across Medellín. Pablo Escobar, the outlaw, was now an elected official. But legitimacy came with risk. Journalists dug into his past, uncovering bodies and blood that trailed behind his fortune. Rivals in Congress mocked him as a gangster in a suit. Foreign governments saw through the mask, pressuring Colombia to sever him from power. Still, Pablo sat in the chamber with calm eyes, speaking out fiercely against extradition. Colombians should be judged in Colombia, he declared. Never by strangers. It wasn't just politics. It was survival disguised as patriotism. Behind the scenes, paranoia grew sharper. He rotated guards constantly, never slept in the same bed twice, and kept pistols within arm's reach. Allies were watched as closely as enemies. He smiled at his children during the day, then moved them in silence at night. To the poor, he remained a savior. To the state, he was a growing cancer. And as Pablo balanced between two faces, politician and outlaw, he knew it was only a matter of time before the country forced him to reveal which one was real. The mask began to slip, and when it did, Colombia felt the weight of Pablo Escobar's true face. On one side, he was Don Pablo, the man who built homes, soccer fields, and clinics in the barrios. Mothers blessed him when he drove by, children waved flags with his name, and families prayed for him at night. On the other side, he was the man who turned fear into law. Journalists who wrote too much, judges who signed extradition orders, politicians who stood in his way, all of them became targets. The doctrine was simple: plata o plomo. Silver or lead. A policeman would find an envelope on his doorstep stuffed with cash one morning, then a bullet with his name etched into it the next. A politician's child might receive a new car as a gift, followed by a whispered warning at school. It was never just a bribe, and never just a threat, it was both, leaving no safe choice. Accept the silver and live comfortably. Refuse, and lead would find you. Soon the phrase was no longer whispered. It became Colombia's unspoken rule. Police stations echoed with it. Courtrooms trembled under it. Even churches weren't free from its shadow. Some men took the money and turned their eyes away. Others chose dignity and were buried for it. The state that was meant to protect its citizens now bent under Escobar's will. Bombings and assassinations shook the country. Car bombs ripped through crowded streets. Entire families vanished overnight. Airplanes were targeted, markets destroyed, government buildings left in ruins. Each act was brutal, but none were random. Every explosion carried a message: Pablo Escobar was above the law, and anyone who tried to cage him would pay in blood. And yet, the contradiction deepened. In the same week a journalist was gunned down in Bogota, Escobar delivered food baskets to the poor in Medellín. After a courthouse was bombed, he built a new neighborhood for families living in shacks. Children lined up to receive Christmas toys from his hands, their faces glowing with joy as if he were St. Nicholas. To them, he was a savior who gave what the government never had. To the elite, he was a terrorist. The paradox wasn't lost on Pablo himself. He leaned into it, feeding both images. Cameras captured him smiling in the barrios, standing among grateful families. Behind closed doors, he signed death orders in silence. He told allies that loyalty could be bought two ways, with bread or with bullets. Both, he believed, lasted longer than justice. But the violence had a cost. Each new killing, each new bomb, hardened Colombia's resolve. The government could no longer pretend this was just organized crime. The United States pushed harder, demanding Pablo's extradition, threatening sanctions if Colombia failed to act. And in Cali, his rivals watched quietly, waiting for the moment his war would burn too hot for even him to control. For now, though, the barrios still sang his name. To the poor, he was untouchable. To the government, he was public enemy number one. And as the gulf between those two images widened, Pablo Escobar stood at the center, knowing that one day, one face would destroy the other. The war was no longer hidden in shadows. It played out in daylight, loud and merciless. A judge sat at home one evening, listening to the quiet hum of a radio, when men stepped from a car across the street. Shots cracked, and by the time neighbors looked out their windows, it was over. No trial, no warning, just the echo of a rule Pablo had turned into law: plata o plomo. Silver or lead. This wasn't just about removing obstacles. It was about making every choice impossible. A police captain would wake to find a briefcase of money waiting for him, enough to retire his whole family. Days later, a bullet carved with his name would arrive in an unmarked envelope. Refuse the bribe, and you'd be buried. Accept it, and you'd live, but with his leash around your neck. Pablo didn't need every man loyal. He only needed them uncertain, afraid to act against him. Colombia's institutions buckled under the pressure. Courthouses, police stations, even Congress itself felt his reach. Bribes slid under doors, threats whispered in corridors. Officials who resisted vanished. Judges who stood firm were assassinated. Journalists who dared print the truth were silenced forever. In some neighborhoods, the sound of an explosion was as common as church bells. The violence tore into everyday life. Markets exploded without warning. Buses were blown apart. Families walking home from school never arrived. In 1989, the Avianca Flight 203 bombing killed more than 100 innocent people, a message meant for one man who never boarded the plane. It showed the world that Escobar's war wasn't just against politicians or police. It was against anyone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet even in the midst of this terror, Pablo's myth continued to grow. In the barrios, his trucks still delivered food and medicine. He still built homes, clinics, and soccer fields. Mothers still told their children to thank Don Pablo when dinner was on the table. Some even prayed for his protection. To them, the bombs and bullets felt far away, while his gifts were tangible, life-saving. He was a contradiction they accepted, because for the poor, survival mattered more than politics. But Pablo himself was changing. The man who once dreamed of ruling Medellín now lived like a prisoner of his own making. He trusted no one completely. He shifted houses nightly, dragging his family along in silence. Guards rotated constantly, radios crackling through the darkness. He ate cautiously, slept lightly, and never allowed himself to forget that betrayal could come from anyone, even his closest men. The Colombian government, under relentless pressure from the United States, responded with force. New extradition laws were passed, and elite police units were formed to hunt him. American agents provided training, equipment, intelligence. The net was tightening. Still, Pablo refused to bend. He told his men again and again, "I will never step into an American prison. Better to die in Colombia." It was not bluster. It was the core of his war, the reason bombs shook Bogota, why blood filled the streets. Extradition was his greatest fear, and he was willing to set the entire country on fire to stop it. When Pablo Escobar walked into politics, it was as if the underworld had stepped into daylight. Cameras flashed as he entered the chamber of Colombia's Congress, not in the rough clothes of Medellín streets but in a polished suit, hair combed back, a calm smile on his face. For the poor, it was proof of his greatness, a boy from the barrios now seated among the nation's lawmakers. For the elite, it was an insult. They whispered that a gangster had invaded their sacred halls. His campaign had never been built on debates or promises. It was built on bricks and mortar. Entire neighborhoods existed because of him. Children went to school stamped with his name. Families lived in homes he had paid for. When the votes came in, it wasn't surprising. He had already bought loyalty the government had long neglected to earn. To his supporters, Pablo was not a criminal stepping into power. He was a man who had lifted them out of poverty and now stood ready to protect them from above. Inside Congress, his focus was clear: fight extradition. He stood at the podium and spoke with conviction. Colombians should be judged in Colombia, he declared. Not in foreign courts. Not by strangers. He painted himself as a patriot, a defender of sovereignty. The crowd of his followers outside cheered, waving banners, chanting his name. But behind the speeches, his motive was survival. He would burn the country before allowing himself to be caged in America. Not everyone was fooled. Journalists dug deeper, publishing reports that tied him to murders, kidnappings, and the rivers of cocaine flooding into the United States. Rivals in politics mocked him openly, calling him a narco in disguise. Foreign governments pressed harder, warning Colombia it would face consequences if it allowed traffickers like Escobar to gain legitimacy. Pablo responded the way he always had. Some opponents were offered thick envelopes of cash, their silence bought in an instant. Others received bullets. One by one, his critics either disappeared or fell quiet. Car bombs shook Bogota. Judges who had once dared to sign extradition orders were assassinated. Every move reminded Colombia that this was not just a congressman, they were dealing with a man who carried an army behind his suit. Still, his myth held strong in Medellín. Crowds gathered whenever he appeared, chanting Don Pablo and throwing flowers at his car. They called him their Robin Hood, their protector, the first man who cared for them. When journalists painted him as a murderer, families in the barrios waved the roofs over their heads as proof that he was something else. To them, he wasn't just above the law, he was above the government. But cracks were forming. Photos linked him to traffickers like Carlos Leder and the Ochoa brothers. Reports tied him to the Avianca bombing. Allies in politics began to distance themselves, afraid the spotlight would burn them too. Pablo noticed. He began attending fewer public sessions, retreating into the shadows again. At night, in one of his safe houses, he paced the floor, pistol close at hand. He had entered politics to shield himself, to build legitimacy that could not be touched. But politics had also painted a target on his back. The government, the Americans, even his rivals in Cali, they were no longer whispering. They were watching, waiting. And Pablo Escobar knew that if he wanted to survive, he would have to fight harder than ever before. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar's war had consumed Colombia. The smiling congressman was gone, replaced by a man who ruled through bombs and fear. The government, under heavy pressure from the United States, made extradition law their weapon. For Pablo, it was the nightmare he could never escape. He had always said he would rather die in Colombia than spend a single night in an American prison. That vow became the foundation of his final war. Judges who upheld extradition were assassinated in daylight. Police convoys were ambushed on mountain roads. Car bombs exploded outside government buildings, shattering windows and lives. In one of his most infamous strikes, Escobar's men bombed Avianca Flight 203, killing more than 100 innocent people just to eliminate one target who never boarded. It shocked the nation, but it also proved a brutal truth: no one was safe. Not in the air, not on the streets, not even in their own homes. The government could no longer contain the chaos. With U.S. agents feeding intelligence and training elite Colombian units, the hunt for Escobar became relentless. Wiretaps, satellites, undercover informants, every tool was used to close in on him. Safe houses were raided, laboratories destroyed, allies captured. Even within his own circle, loyalty began to crumble. Some men flipped, trading secrets for protection. Others grew tired of the blood and sought escape. Meanwhile, the Cali cartel, his old rivals, saw opportunity. While Medellín burned, Cali quietly built its influence, feeding information to authorities, smiling as Escobar fought a war that drained his own empire. The myth of invincibility began to crack. And yet, in the barrios of Medellín, some still cheered his name. Mothers still prayed for Don Pablo, remembering the food baskets and the homes he had built. Children still kicked soccer balls on fields he had paid for. Even as bombs rattled the city, their loyalty to him lingered. It was the last piece of his legend still intact. But inside Pablo's world, paranoia had devoured him. He moved every night, dragging his family from one safe house to another. He slept with pistols under his pillow, radios buzzing with the voices of guards outside. His circle shrank until even longtime allies were kept at arm's length. He was no longer a king in a palace. He was a hunted man, trapped by the same fear that had always chased him: fear of sleep, fear of betrayal, fear of time running out. On December 2nd, 1993, that time ended. After months of pursuit, Colombian forces tracked him to a modest house in Medellín. Gunfire tore through the walls as he tried to escape across a rooftop. Moments later, Pablo Escobar, once the most feared man in the world, lay dead in the street. Some said it was a soldier's bullet. Others believed he turned the gun on himself rather than face capture. To this day, the truth remains debated. What is certain is this: the king who built an empire on silver and lead, the man who feared sleep because he thought it would betray him, finally found the one rest he could not avoid. His story ended not in a mansion or a courtroom, but on a rooftop, under the same Medellín sky where he once dreamed of owning the world. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it powerful, don't forget to comment below, like this video, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries and gangster stories for sleep. Your support helps keep these stories alive.